Alright, welcome to another episode of the Cassels Cast. My name's Eamon Cassels. We're going to be doing a bit of a different episode this week. It's just going to be a solo episode where I break down and grade every single team's offseason. Next week, we're going to get back to guests, but I just really wanted to give you guys an episode since it's been a while. First, starting things off with the Cleveland Cavaliers, I'm going to give them a B. They didn't have a very active offseason. Their major move was trading Isaac Okoro for Lonzo Ball, which I do think makes a lot of sense, given that Okoro was really out of their rotation and that they could have used another guard. So I do like Ball's fit with the team on paper. I am a little bit concerned about the injury history that he has and sort of his role with the team, but as a backup point guard, I think it's a really solid fit, especially given that they only gave up Okoro to get him. And then their other move was the let in Ty Jerome walk. He ended up signing with the Grizzlies. This part of their offseason I don't love. Just given the price, I thought they could have potentially re-signed him. He ended up going a little bit cheaper than expected. So I was a little bit disappointed with that standpoint of their offseason, but being able to get Lonzo as a replacement for Jerome, essentially, is a solid pickup, and I do think it's smart for this team who won over 60 games to really run it back with this core. So I do see them as top contenders in the East. I mean, they really didn't do much this offseason. I think some people were sort of anticipating changes given how the playoffs ended up playing out and their disappointing loss to the Pacers. But at the same time, with how dominant this team was in the regular season, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that they didn't make any massive changes. Next, moving on to my beloved Boston Celtics. This was always going to be an unfortunate offseason for them. They always were going to have to get under the second apron, and then that was sort of accelerated with Jason Tatum's devastating injury. So this was never going to be an amazing offseason for them. With that being said, I didn't really like how it played out. I'm going to go with a C+. I guess first, starting with some of the positives, I thought they got great value back for Holiday. It ended up just being a one-for-one swap with the Blazers, where the Celtics got Anthony Simons back. Simons, 10 years younger than Holiday, and a really high-level player. You can be concerned about the defense. That's certainly a drop-off, but really just as a bucket getter and as a floor spacer, I think he's a nice fit with this team and a nice fit with Missoula Ball in general. So I did really like that pickup, and I thought they were able to really maximize their value for Holiday, who is aging and not on the best contract despite having really solid value. So I did like that part of it. The Porzingis trade, especially with how the playoffs played out, his really mysterious illness and then lack of production, on top of the fact that he was an expiring contract with just an extensive injury history, you're never going to get great value for him. You end up getting George Niang in a second pick. That's fine. I think George Niang, he's a solid player. He can space the floor a little bit, give you some quality forward minutes. Obviously, I think fans were a little bit disappointed just in the value. Maybe people were expecting more, but at the same time, I don't think you could have been expecting a ton for Porzingis, so I wasn't really disappointed in that at all, and then you were able to really shed, with both of those trades, significant salary. You end up getting under the second apron, so I think that's huge, and that's a win for them, especially with Porzingis. I was a little bit concerned that they might have to package picks with him to really entice teams to take on that contract and that risk, so I was happy that they didn't have to do that. So those parts are solid. I think draft-wise they did pretty well. Hugo Gonzalez is a really interesting prospect, very versatile, really high potential, and getting him at 28 is solid. I was definitely impressed with him in Summer League. The defensive energy, the playmaking, it's all very intriguing to me. We'll see what type of role he plays as a rookie. I'm not expecting a ton. And then Amari Williams and Max Shugla as second-round picks, I think were solid value. Williams just a really intriguing player as a passing big man. I could see him playing a little bit this year just because of how bad the Celtics' center rotation is. We're going to get to that in a second. But I could see him actually having somewhat of a role. I do think he'll spend some time in Maine as well, especially early on, just given that he was a second-round pick and he's on a two-way. Shugla, I don't know how much he'll play because the Celtics do have a little bit better guard depth, but at the same time, pretty intriguing player. Very solid perimeter defender, can shoot, play make. So I do like the value that they got for him in the 50s. So I think those were really three solid picks, and I'm intrigued by what role these rookies will play. We'll see what direction they go. I don't personally see this Celtics team trying to completely lean into a tank or a rebuild. This is sort of a weird gap year. I will say unless injuries arise. If some injuries happen, then they might have to be forced to lean into the tank. At the same time, I see this team as a playing team competing for one of those playoff spots. Obviously not ideal, considering they just won a championship in 2024, but at the same time with the Tatum injury and then the trades they were sort of forced to make with the second apron. That's just sort of where this franchise is at. Now, sort of getting into the negative sides of this offseason and why they're dragged down to a C+. I mean, obviously with those trades, especially the Porzingis one, you were never really going to get better, so that always hurts. But I think where this offseason really doesn't completely sit right with me is just how they decided to approach the center rotation. You saw Luke Cornett, he left to the Spurs. He got, I think it was 4 years, $40 million. So that was something the Celtics were never going to be able to afford. And I always thought it was at least one of these centers between Cornett and Horford were going to leave. Looks like they're going to lose both of them. Horford still hasn't officially signed anywhere, which is just kind of crazy to me, considering it's damn near August. But that's where we're at. It looks like he's highly unlikely to return to the Celtics. So looking like he's going to go to the Warriors. We'll talk about that later, but that hasn't still been confirmed in August, which is crazy. But looks like you're going to lose both of them. I thought they might have been able to retain one of them, especially Horford, with this likely being his last year. I thought he was sort of going to give the Celtics that hometown discount and he would just play it out on a little bit of a cheaper contract, but that doesn't look like it's in the cards for him, unfortunately. So to address their center need after losing Porzingis via trade and then Cornett and Horford in free agency, they went out and signed Luka Garza from the Minnesota Timberwolves, and now they have a center rotation of Garza, Neemias Queta, and Xavier Tillman, along with rookie Amari Williams. So we'll see how much he plays, like I said before. But yeah, all due respect to these guys, I think this is probably the worst center rotation in the league. And I think in the modern NBA, that's a massive problem. And I do think Garza is an intriguing offensive player. I just don't think the defense is ever going to get there. And that's a massive problem considering the way the Celtics like to play. They like to switch on everything. Defensively, he can't really fit into that scheme too well. He's on the younger side, so maybe he can develop into a true rotational center, but he didn't play much in Minnesota. And yeah, I didn't love the sign-in personally, especially because that's sort of the only center sign-in they decided to go with. They also brought in Josh Minott from the Timberwolves, who's an intriguing forward, very good defensively. We'll see how the offense can get there, so sort of the opposite of Garza, obviously different positions, but opposite strengths and weaknesses there. But yeah, I mean, I think they could have just addressed the center position in a little bit of a better way. Given their financial situation, they obviously didn't have a ton of money to spend, but I would have looked at signing another center instead of Minott. Even though Minott is an intriguing young player, I just don't think forward depth was as crucial of a need compared to center depth. And yeah, I just really don't like Garza's fit in the Celtics system, and I'm a little bit concerned about that. If he's your third center, I think that's fine. But you're really counting on him to be that second or even first center. I think Queta's going to get the starting job, but at the same time, you're going to be counting on Garza for big minutes. And that's just something he hasn't been able to provide throughout his career so far. Obviously, he's been on a really good team with the Timberwolves, and before that, the Pistons, who weren't that good. But he's never really been a rotational center, and it's really all connected to his defense. So that's just a massive concern for me with this offseason and overall just this team headed into next year. You definitely do have to mention that they didn't have too many options, but at the same time, I think they had better options than simply signing just Garza. I think Garza's a fine sign-in, but him being your only sign-in, given just how weak this position group is a massive problem to me. I would have even looked at Charles Bassey, who had a really good summer league with the Celtics. I'm not sure why they didn't sign him. Really solid, sort of rim runner defender, grabs rebounds like a maniac. I thought he low-key would be their best center right now. So I just didn't love that approach. I'm looking at some other centers that I think they could have looked into. Day'Ron Sharpe from the Brooklyn Nets I thought would have been an intriguing option for them specifically. Other than that, there's not a whole lot of options, but like I mentioned, maybe a Sharpe, maybe a Bassey I thought would have just been a little bit better than Garza. Alright, so let's move on to the New York Knicks. The New York Knicks had a fairly interesting offseason. I guess we can start off with the coaching change. They decided to fire Tom Thibodeau after making the Eastern Conference Finals, their first Eastern Conference Finals in 25 years. So I thought that was an interesting move. Thibodeau certainly does have his flaws. He's not the most creative offensive mind. He doesn't tend to play his bench, although I would argue that bench wasn't super good. But yeah, nevertheless, that's what they decided to do. They ultimately hired Mike Brown, the former Sacramento Kings coach, after really trying to poach a bunch of head coaches from their current teams, which was a very interesting strategy. Overall, I think Mike Brown's a fine hire. I just don't see how much different he is than Thibodeau. He's a little bit more creative offensively, but he's also sort of that old school coach, and I don't know how that's really going to mesh with this Knicks team, who was sort of, by some accounts, not thrilled with Thibodeau's style of coaching. So I'm interested to see how that's going to work. I do think the offense is going to be better. Yeah, moving on from the coaching side of things, though, I did really like their offseason. I'm going to go with a B+, mostly because of these two signings. They signed Jordan Clarkson, who's going to be really a microwave scorer off the bench, which they desperately needed. Some extra creation, just some extra scoring off that bench. So I think that's an awesome pickup for them. And then other than that, they signed Gershon Yabusele, who's a really versatile player, and they got both of these players on great deals. But I thought, especially Yabusele, I thought was an incredible value contract. He's a guy that can really punish mismatches inside or space the floor outside, and I think he fits really nicely next to Karl Anthony Towns. I'm really excited to see that. Or they could even run some super big lineups with Towns, Robinson, and Yabusele. I don't think they're going to do that a whole lot, but they have that option. Yabusele is just a guy that can really fit with multiple lineups, and I think that's what's really intriguing about this. And then he also does provide some insurance for Mitchell Robinson if he gets injured. Just another guy that can play that center role next to Towns. I think he's almost just a much better version of what they had last year with Precious Achiuwa, especially just given his floor space. And so I love that fit. Honestly, if it was just these two free agent signings, Knicks would definitely be in the A range. I'm just a little bit dubious of the coaching change. I didn't personally love it, but I kind of get where they're coming from. So yeah, overall, I'm going to go with a B+ for the Knicks. And if I had to pick a team right now, given what I saw from them in the playoffs, I'm going to pick the Knicks to come out of the Eastern Conference. I think they would be my favorites. I'm still a little bit concerned with how the Cavs really finished their season in the playoffs, and I just favor what I saw from the Knicks. So I think they're in an awesome spot overall. All right, moving on to the Indiana Pacers. I'm going to go with a C- here. This was always going to be sort of an unfortunate offseason for them, given how Tyrese Halliburton went down in that Game 7, just the most devastating way possible to tear his Achilles as they're really on the brink of winning a title. But with that being said, I didn't like how they handled the Miles Turner situation. There's sort of conflicting reports on how much they offered him, but most of the reports are sort of saying that they did lowball a guy who's been a high-quality center for them for 10 years. I do understand Turner has his flaws, and I'm personally not the biggest fan of him, but letting him walk for nothing is just a horrible decision. And then they were able to fill that center void in with Jay Huff of the Memphis Grizzlies, who's a really solid backup center. He provides some of the floor spacing that Turner does, but he's a backup center, and they're sort of going to be counting on him to really take up their main center minutes. You got him along with Isaiah Jackson, Tony Bradley, and James Wiseman, who are all just super unproven as that number one center role. And I don't love this move for the Pacers. I think there were a couple of things they could have done to really avoid this problem. I think first and foremost, you just pay Miles Turner, even if the contract's not ideal. And you might have to dip into the luxury tax, which was a concern by many reports with this team. They didn't want to go into the luxury tax, which is understanding. But at the same time, you still have options after re-signing Turner. You could have traded a guy like Obi Toppin to clear a little bit of cap, get some value back there. I just think that's a better option than letting Turner walk for nothing. Or you could have re-signed Turner and then ultimately traded him on that contract to get something in return for him. You could have just traded him at the deadline or something like that. I just think one of those options would have been a little bit better, just to retain the asset and then really to get some value back from him and then not have such a clear hole at center, because along with the Celtics, this is one of the worst center rotations in the league. I really don't know how to view this team. They still do have really, really solid guard play and forward depth. It's just that center position is just such a clear weakness, and then you take away the engine of this team in Tyrese Halliburton, and I don't know how good they're going to be. I think they're going to be sort of similar to the Celtics, where they're going to try to compete for one of those playoff spots, ultimately probably fall somewhere within the play-in range, but yeah, just a super unfortunate offseason for them, just where they were in June. Damn near won the NBA Finals. I don't know how good this team's going to be. I think they have a lot of question marks, and I don't understand why you want to just try to hang on to Turner. So yeah, C- for me with the Pacers. Now we're going to go to the Milwaukee Bucks, who actually signed Miles Turner. I'm going to give them a B-. We can start with that move. They're really able to get a massive upgrade there with Turner and then Brook Lopez leave into the Clippers. Turner at this stage of his career especially is just a much better version of Brook Lopez. Yet similar value floor spacing, but he's just a lot more mobile, a lot more capable of playing big minutes. So yeah, I think that's a massive upgrade, and I really do love that pickup. However, didn't love how they were forced to waive Damian Lillard. Now, Lillard obviously dealing with the Achilles injury, so he wasn't going to be able to play this season anyway. However, having dead money for the next 5 years on your books is just not something I would personally try to do. Now, this was the only way they were able to sign Turner. So yeah, forced into a difficult situation really. I understand why they did it, but I think that part of the sign-in sort of went a little bit under the radar. I think just paying Dame for the next 5 years while he's not on your roster is just not the best option, especially when you look at this team and Giannis trade rumors are swirling. He says he wants to be in Milwaukee for now. We'll see how long that lasts. I do feel like we're trending to a Giannis trade eventually, and personally, I would have just ripped off the Band-Aid. It's a lot easier said than done, especially given what Giannis means to this franchise, but at the same time, I don't see this situation getting any better. I don't view the Bucks as one of those top-tier contenders, even in a weak Eastern Conference. I don't really see a path that they make it past the second round of the playoffs, and I think this time next year, Giannis is going to be wearing a different uniform. When he's ultimately traded, I have no idea, but I just don't see Giannis committing to Milwaukee long-term, just given how flawed this roster is outside of him. Really outside of him and Turner, this roster is just sort of deficient of talent, quite frankly. You look at Kyle Kuzma, he might be third best player, I don't know. They signed Cole Anthony, I thought that was a solid pickup. But yeah, I mean, this team, they couldn't make it work really with Dame and Giannis, which I think is mostly just a testament to how poor of a supporting cast they have. And I don't see them making it work without Dame, even though Turner is a significant upgrade over Brook Lopez. I just think their perimeter talent and overall depth is just too bad, and I just don't think they have a path to compete in. So I don't love this situation for them overall, but at the same time, I can also understand not wanting to trade Giannis, just how important he is to that franchise, and you don't control your own picks, so you don't necessarily want to go into a rebuild, but eventually I think that's something they have to do, and that's something that I would have just done this offseason to maximize his value. He's a free agent in 2027, so his value isn't going to go up despite him just being an incredible player. But we'll see how this season plays out. I still do view them as a playoff team, and I definitely respect them trying and attempting to build a more competitive roster around Giannis, so that's why I still gave them B-. I think they sort of did the best with what they had to build a competent team around him, but I still just don't think it's enough. Like I said, I do really like the Turner pickup as well as the Cole Anthony sign-in. I thought those were two really solid moves, so that saves them from a lower grade here, and I'm going to go with a B-. Next, moving on to the Detroit Pistons, who were probably the best story of last season. I'm going to go with a B- again here. Another team that was really put into an unfortunate situation with the Malik Beasley gambling scandal that came out shortly before free agency. Beasley was such an important part of the team last year, but unfortunately you can't re-sign a guy that's in the middle of a serious gambling investigation. So yeah, that really did put a damper on their offseason in many ways. They were able to sign Caris LeVert to sort of fill that void. I think LeVert's a solid pickup, really good shot creator, more of an isolation scorer instead of a spot-up shooter like Beasley, but I think that's a really solid fit, and I think he's going to be a really nice piece for Detroit's bench. Tim Hardaway Jr. did walk, who's another kind of a big loss for them, and then Dennis Schroeder is another player that I look at as a big loss for this Pistons team. But at the same time, I do think they have the infrastructure to sort of cover up those losses. I'm expecting a massive year from Asar Thompson. Obviously, he doesn't have the shooting capabilities of those guys, but as an overall player, I think he's going to have an incredible year, sort of similar to the jump that we saw from his twin brother this past year. I think Asar is going to be in for a massive leap entering his third season. So I think that will be a huge part of the Pistons' overall season. But in terms of their offseason, yeah, I didn't love it. I'm actually going to bump them down to a C+, now that I'm talking myself into it a little bit. The other part that I didn't really love about their offseason was the Duncan Robinson pickup. You dealt Simone Fontecchio, who I do think is a slightly worse version of Robinson. I think Robinson's a little bit better of a shooter, and he's a little bit more proven. But the contract that they signed him to was just not ideal. I think it was a little bit of an overpay for Robinson, and I would have just rather had the cheaper option in Fontecchio there. So yeah, I didn't love this Pistons offseason. Like I said, the Beasley situation put them in a really difficult spot, but I didn't love what they did to recover from that. In terms of Schroeder, I think that's also a fairly big loss. However, Jaden Ivey returning from injury will definitely help. So I do think this team has enough to recover from not having the best offseason, and I do like where they are overall as a team, but at the same time, just strictly based off this offseason, I don't love it for the Pistons. Next, moving on to the Orlando Magic, a team's offseason who I absolutely do love, and that they're going to be getting an A here. They gave up 4 first-round picks in a pick swap along with Kentavious Caldwell-Pope and Cole Anthony to acquire Desmond Bane. So I thought that was a home run trade for them. A lot of people are going to point to the picks and say it's a bit of an overpay, but at the same time, this Magic team is good enough to where those picks aren't going to be super valuable, and Desmond Bane fills such an important need for this team in terms of three-point shooting and perimeter shot creation. So I thought that was just a home run move, and I do view this Magic team, along with the Cavs and the Knicks, as the real clear contenders in this Eastern Conference. I think they're going to be a top 3 seed. We already saw these last few years how good the defense is, the potential there with Franz and Paolo, and what they really just needed was some shooting, and Desmond Bane fills that as one of the best three-point shooters in the league. Another sneaky move that I liked was picking up Tyus Jones. They also did need some perimeter playmaking, and Jones is one of the better playmakers in the league. So I thought that was also a really nice pickup for the Magic that sort of went under the radar. In the draft, they ended up going with Jace Richardson at the end of the first round, and then Noah Penda in the early second round. I thought both of those picks were really solid, especially Richardson, again, just given his capabilities as a floor spacer and three-point shooter. So I think they really addressed their main needs, and I do view them in that top tier of Eastern Conference contenders. I do think if Jalen Suggs didn't get injured last season, they would have had a much better seed, and we would have looked at this team a little bit differently. Even in the playoffs, although it only went 5 games, they were super competitive against the Celtics, and dating back to the 2024 playoffs against the Cavs, they took that team to 7 games. So I think this is a team really built for playoff success, especially with these new moves. All right, we got the Miami Heat coming up next. This was a weird team for me this offseason. I was a little bit disappointed when I saw their offer for Kevin Durant. They didn't want to really include just about anybody, including Jaime Jaquez, who was getting DNPs for this team last season. So I was a little bit dubious of their offseason, but then they ended up getting Norman Powell for really next to nothing. I think they gave up Kyle Anderson, Kevin Love, and a second-round pick. Definitely interested to see the fit with Powell there alongside Tyler Hero. I don't think that's necessarily the best fit defensively, but at the same time, for that price to get a player of Powell's caliber is just a no-brainer move, and I think it was a really solid pickup for the Heat. It also opens up some flexibility headed into next offseason, so they're going to have a little bit more cap room. In a weaker Eastern Conference, I could see this team competing for a top 5 seed. I don't view them as contenders at all, but I definitely thought Powell makes them better. Just from a raw talent standpoint, like I said, the fit is a little bit questionable, but I definitely like what they did in terms of upgrading their roster from a talent standpoint. So I got to give the Heat their respect there, and I'm going to give them a B+. I think they could have done a little bit more, but overall, just that trade was the big one, and I thought that was a really nice move for them. The other thing I just want to highlight quickly is drafting Kaspers Giacochonis at pick 20. I thought that was amazing value. It was well documented that they were really eyeing Walter Clayton Jr. The Jazz ended up trading up and taking him a couple picks before the Heat were on the clock, but at the same time, I think Giacochonis is a great pick. The Heat desperately need more perimeter shot creation and playmaking, and that's what Giacochonis provides. He was viewed as a lottery talent throughout most of the draft process, so getting him at 20 is really no-brainer move. So I think that paired with the Powell trade sets up a really solid offseason for the Heat, going with a B+. Next, the Atlanta Hawks, who are definitely one of my winners of the offseason. I'm going to go with my first A+ here. They bought low on Kristaps Porzingis. We'll see how that works out fit-wise, if he can stay healthy and if he can really keep up his production to where it was throughout most of the regular season instead of the playoffs where he really fell off that cliff with the mysterious illness he was suffering. I think he's an awesome fit next to Trae Young as a floor spacer, as a rim protector, as a lob threat. He really just makes all the sense in the world next to Trae. And that position was a real area of need for this Hawks team. So I thought getting him for the price they did, they only gave up Georges Niang and then Terrence Mann, along with a first-round pick, but they had to really package that first-round pick just to get off Mann's contract, which was seen as not a desirable deal. So I think that's just amazing value to get a player of Porzingis, and really the value he brings to this team I think is going to be immense as long as he can stay healthy. The other move I want to talk about, we'll talk about this from the Pelican side later, is they traded down 10 spots and they were able to get an unprotected first round pick in next year's draft. That's going to be either it's going to be the better pick between the Pelicans or the Bucks. So I thought that was just an incredible trade for the Hawks. They ended up taking Georgia's Asa Newell, who's another big man who does sort of fit that need as well, who apparently they considered at pick 13. So they were able to trade down 10 spots, get the guy that they supposedly wanted at 13, and you get one of the most valuable assets that was traded this offseason in that unprotected Pelicans-Bucks pick, which could very well end up being a top 3 pick in an absolutely loaded 2026 draft class. So that was probably the best trade of the offseason, quite frankly, on draft night. I just thought that was incredible value for the Hawks. And they really didn't stop there. They were able to land Nickeil Alexander-Walker in free agency, who I think is another guy who just fits perfectly next to Trae Young as a defender, secondary ball handler, guy that can shoot a little bit as well. I think just an incredible fit. And you look at him, Dyson Daniels, Jalen Johnson, Zachary Grisachet. I think this is a team that's really tailor-made around Trae Young, and I would have high expectations heading into this upcoming season for this Hawks team, especially in a weaker Eastern Conference. Another move that sort of went under the radar a little bit was landing Luke Kennard. He's just a really good shooter, so having those shooters and the defense and the versatility around Trae, I think just makes this an incredible offseason. I thought all of their moves were awesome, and yeah, no complaints. Just, yeah, A-plus offseason for the Hawks. Just really incredible stuff. Next, we move on to the Chicago Bulls, who really didn't do much. They're sort of stuck in the middle. I'm going to go with a C-. I mean, I just don't know where this franchise is headed. I think they should lean into a rebuild. It looks like they kind of are, especially with the Noah Sengay pick at 12, which I think was a solid move. Super high upside young forward. So I think he's a solid fit with this team, especially if they want to go into a rebuilding direction. Intrigued to see him next to Buzelis. At the same time, I would have liked to see a little bit more activity from the Bulls. I do think, before I get more on the negative side, I do think they're handling this Josh Giddey situation right. They've been in deep negotiations with him for about a month now, and I think they're handling it right, given that not a lot of teams have cap, and he's a restricted free agent. It sort of limits his market, so they're not going to overpay for Giddey, which I think is a smart move. I do think they'll ultimately reach a fair contract with him, and he'll be back with the Bulls next season. But at the same time, I do like how they're handling that. However, when I look at what some of these teams are getting for a Desmond Bane, and I see that the Bulls still have Kobe White on the roster, who I'm a huge fan of, by the way, and I think could be super valuable to multiple teams. I just don't know why you're keeping a guy like Kobe White. You look at his contract, he's on an expiring $12 million contract. So are you going to pay him a massive contract next year as you're sort of entering a rebuild? I don't know if that's the best move for this franchise going forward, even though White's a really nice player and he's really essential to their floor spacing. I think you could get multiple first-round picks for a guy like Kobe White, and I just don't see why you don't jump on that opportunity. So just really a little confused there, and other than that, they just haven't done a whole lot. I would have just liked them to fully commit to this rebuild. Trading a guy like White, I think we've seen how holding on to these assets, whether it be a Levine or DeRozan or Vucevic now, who they might buy out, it just doesn't really work. And you don't get the value that these guys are worth. So I don't love this offseason for the Bulls. I just would have treated Kobe White. I will bump them up to a C because they haven't done anything like that terrible. So yeah, I'm going to change that one to a C instead of a C-. But yeah, overall, just don't love this position the Bulls are in, and yeah, a little bit confused by this direction, as I'm sure many fans are. Toronto Raptors also had a little bit of a weird offseason. I'm going to go with a C as well. They didn't do anything crazy. I would say the craziest part and why I do bump them down a little bit is they fired their GM, Masai Ujiri, right after the draft. So I'm not sure why you let the guy draft. I think they did say Bobby Webster was sort of controlling some of those picks, but I don't know. I mean, just fire your GM before the draft if it was that big of a deal. If that was already the direction you were headed. I don't think his draft was bad enough for him to be fired right after either, so it's just really strange. Kind of a strange direction, really just a jigsaw puzzle of team, in my opinion. You got a lot of talent. I'm just not sure how it all fits together. Their big move, I guess, was extended Jakob Poeltl. Very solid center, kind of a big number to pay for him. And then you drafted Colin Murray-Boyles, who I'm super high on as a prospect. Very versatile defender, solid shot creator, secondary playmaker. Super high on him, but he's a non-shooter on a team that has a bunch of non-shooters, so I'm not sure how he fits with the rest of the core. I just don't think they have a team that fits together despite the talent being there. I do think they'll compete for a play-in spot, but I just don't love the fit of this team and a little bit confused by their direction. So yeah, I'm going to go with a C. All right, moving on to the Brooklyn Nets. This was one of my least favorite off seasons. I was pretty disappointed with them. I thought they were really positioned to have one of the better off seasons, and they ultimately had one of the worst off seasons in my eyes. I'm going to go with a D for their grade. Their big move and their big way that they used their cap space was landed Michael Porter Jr. in exchange for Cam Johnson. They also got a first-round pick in that deal, but you look at these two players, they're pretty similar. I just think Cam Johnson's a better version of MPJ, considering what he can do on the ball. A little bit of a better defender, not much better, but a little bit better there, and he's on a much cheaper contract, most importantly. So I think, given that MPJ is really on one of the worst contracts in the league, I'm shocked that they only were able to get just one first-round pick. I think Cam Johnson's value could have been much higher. You could have gotten somebody not exactly like Michael Porter Jr., but I think you could have gotten more of a pick-centric package. For a rebuilding team, I think that's more of the avenue they should have gone instead of sort of making a lateral move and getting a pick that's not going to convey until the 20s. I just don't think that's ideal. And then you look at their draft, it was a really, really curious draft. They had 5 first-round picks. They decided to use all 5 of them. I don't hate using all 5 of them, especially if the value isn't there to trade up. But at the same time, when I look at what the Pelicans gave the Hawks to trade up 10 spots, I'm looking at the Nets at 8 and thinking, hey, why didn't they do that? I don't know. Why not do something like that, consolidate a little bit? I don't know, try to trade up again into the lottery or something. I'm just a little bit confused on why they spent all 5 of their first-round picks. Again, I don't think it's the worst idea in the world. But then you look at the players that they drafted, and it gets even more curious to me. They drafted 4 guys who their main strength headed into the draft was playmaking, and arguably all 4 of their main weaknesses was shooting. In Yegor Denham, Danny Wolf, Ben Sheriff, and Nolan Triari. I think the fit of those guys, I do think they're all very solid prospects, very intriguing prospects. Not necessarily guys that I was low on, but the fit of those 4 guys on the same team just doesn't make any sense to me. So yeah, very puzzled by that. For the Nets, I did love their Drake Powell pickup. Definitely one of my favorite prospects, so I'll give the Nets some kudos there. But at the same time, the other 4 prospects that they picked, I don't see how they can fit together, and I think it's really sort of boom or bust, and I think they just had so many better options in the draft, and they really just didn't take advantage of that. And then, even if you look at their cap space, I think they could have utilized it a little bit better, obviously, like I talked about with the MPJ thing, but why not throw some money at some of these restricted free agents, whether it be a Quentin Grimes or even a Josh Giddey? Just see what these guys are worth, get another team to overpay, even a Jonathan Kuminga, who they were really linked to throughout the season, and then it sort of died down as the offseason approached. I thought they could have just handled that a little bit better. We'll see how this Cam Thomas contract fiasco plays out. Currently, they're in negotiations, and they're miles apart, apparently. I can see why the Nets don't want to pay Cam Thomas a ton. But yeah, we'll see how it works out. I thought the Nets were really positioned nicely from an asset standpoint, and they just really didn't take advantage of it in the way I would have hoped. All right, moving on to the Philadelphia 76ers. I'm going to give them a B. They didn't do a whole lot other than draft an Edgecombe. For what it's worth, I do really like that pick. I'm intrigued to see how he fits next to Maxey and McCain. But yeah, we'll see. I think this team's sort of at a crossroads with Embiid and his injury history. It's kind of tough. They might have to eventually lean into a rebuild, but at the same time, having Edgecombe, Maxey, McCain, I think that's super nice. They ended up getting Janai Brum in the second round, which I thought was a nice little steal there, and he can maybe play some backup 5 minutes for them. Not a high upside guy by any means, but I think he has a relatively high floor, and he's NBA ready at the very least, given his age. So yeah, they didn't do a whole lot, but I liked the minor moves that they made. We'll see how this Quentin Grimes contract situation plays out, as he's yet another restricted free agent that remains unsigned. But yeah, not a super exciting or busy offseason for the Sixers. So I'll just give them a B. I thought they did a solid job with what they had. Moving on to the Charlotte Hornets, I actually really like this offseason. I'm going to go with a B+. I think they had one of the better drafts. They got Con Knippel at pick 4. I think that's an excellent pick. I think he fits really nicely next to LaMelo, given his scoring prowess, and I think they can complement each other super nicely. And then you look at what they did outside of that. They got Liam McNeely after trading Mark Williams to the Phoenix Suns, so they were able to get another first-round pick there. McNeely could have been a lottery pick. Talent-wise, he just didn't have the best season at UConn, but at the same time, he looked really good at Summer League, and I think he fits next to Con pretty nicely. And both of those players are a little bit safer, and the floor spacing they provide, I think, will be huge for this Hornets team. And then you look at their other moves in the draft, drafting Ryan Kalkbrenner and Sion James in the second round. I think both of those players are really nice fits, especially Kalkbrenner as a center, because that's a position that they desperately need. And we'll see. I think he could be able to contribute immediately. I think the Hornets might need him looking at their center rotation, which is really the only reason that they are a bump down. I thought they could have done a little bit more outside of Kalkbrenner to address their center hole, especially after losing Mark Williams. Other than that, I thought they had a super nice offseason. They were able to pick up Colin Sexton in exchange for Yusuf Nurkic, which was a really weird trade. I thought Sexton's value would be much higher than that. Apparently it's not. But I think getting him next to LaMelo Ball, along with Spencer Dinwiddie, who they signed, really nice insurance. I have to think that they're considering trading LaMelo at this point, given his injury history and the moves that they made. Although, if they want to keep him, I think they're well positioned to survive in the case that he gets injured, or just really survive those non-LaMelo minutes, which has been a problem for this team. So I think addressing that guard play was huge. They also re-signed Terrence Mann, or Trey Mann, which was a nice pickup for them. So yeah, it's a really solid offseason for them. I think they could climb the standings. I don't think they're going to be playing territory, but I don't think they'll be one of the worst two teams in the East next season. So yeah, B+, I thought it was a really solid offseason for them. All right, moving on to the last team in the Eastern Conference, and that's going to be the Washington Wizards. I really love this offseason for the Wizards. First starting off with their draft, Trey Johnson. I thought that was an absolutely awesome selection for them at pick 6. He projects to be that elite go-to scorer that they desperately need. Despite having a really solid rebuild so far, I think they really lack that star, and I think Trey Johnson can be that star for them. And they also drafted Will Riley in the mid-first round. I thought that was another really solid pick. Then they made a big trade, essentially swapping Jordan Poole for CJ McCollum. I think McCollum is the better basketball player, and his deal is expiring next offseason, so they'll have a ton of cap space opening up. A lot of extra financial flexibility there. So yeah, this has just been an awesome A+ offseason for the Wizards. They also traded for Cam Whitmore for next to nothing. So taking a chance on a talented young player like Whitmore, I think, is a really strong positive for this team as well. Really no complaints. I think this Wizards team is more equipped to win next season, and they also set themselves up nicely for the future with some of the moves they made. So yeah, I thought it was a really awesome offseason for the Wizards. All right, moving on to the West, starting with the defending champion, Oklahoma City Thunder. I'm going to give the Thunder an A. They didn't make any major moves, and they didn't really have to. They traded away Dylan Jones. That was their only real loss, and then they ended up drafting Thomas Sorber and Brooks Barnhizer. Don't know too much about Barnhizer, but he projects to be a really solid defender from what I'm aware of. And then Thomas Sorber, I think, was an absolutely awesome pick. If you look at maybe one potential weakness for this team, despite how great they were, it would be maybe that center depth, especially with Hartenstein potentially leaving next offseason due to financial reasons. Thunder have a team option, so getting a potential Hartenstein replacement as well as just some insurance for Chet, I think is a really smart move for them. And Sorber is a prospect that I was super high on, so yeah, I thought it was a really nice offseason for the Thunder. They got a little bit better and pretty much retained the same exact roster that just won 68 games in a title, so yeah, kind of no-brainer. I'll give them an A. I thought it was a really nice offseason for them. All right, moving on to the Houston Rockets. I'm going to give them an A+. They obviously made one of the biggest moves in this offseason by trading for Kevin Durant. Durant really fits in nicely, first and foremost. I think the Rockets really needed some extra scoring and really that go-to scorer as well as some extra floor spacing, and Durant can provide that at an elite level, regardless of his age. And then you look at what they gave up to get him. They didn't give up a ton. They gave up the number 10 pick, which ended up being Kaman Malawach. I think that's a solid pickup for the Suns. We'll get to there later, but you give up the number 10 pick, you give up Dylan Brooks, Jalen Green, and 5 second-round picks. So You didn't overpay at all. I thought it was just incredible value to get a player of Durant's caliber. And I think the Rockets were the team that made the most sense given how they needed that go-to scorer in Durant and also how many assets they have and still have. So they could get even better if another star comes on the market. So yeah, this Rockets team is really positioned amazingly over the next few years, and the Durant pickup is massive, and they're clear contenders in a loaded Western Conference. I think the cherry on top of this team's offseason and why they're getting an A+ for me is picking up Dorian Finney-Smith. You look at this team, they're loaded with just gritty wing defenders, and Dorian Finney-Smith fits that mold perfectly. I have no problem with them sort of doubling down on this identity and getting another highly impactful and versatile defender. I think this team is, like I said, one of the better teams in the West, and they're just clear contenders, and both of those moves really stand out as two of the best moves of the offseason. They also brought back Clint Capella. He was with the Hawks for several years, but started his career in Houston. A little bit interesting because they also extended Steven Adams and, of course, have Alperen Şengün, but having some extra options in the front court, I don't mind, especially next to Şengün, and we saw the success of those double big lineups. That was a move that kind of surprised me, but I don't hate it at all. So yeah, I think this Rockets team had just an incredible offseason and are just clear winners to me. Moving on to the Los Angeles Lakers, I'm going to give them a B-. I don't think they had a terrible offseason by any means, but I still didn't love it. Especially you look at the way they handled that Dorian Finney-Smith situation. I thought it could have been handled a lot better. They were lowballing him, and they were also spreading information about his injuries to try to really tank his value, which ultimately led to him leaving for one of the Lakers' main threats in the Western Conference in the Houston Rockets. So I thought that situation was just handled terribly. You go out and you get Jake LaRavia as a replacement. LaRavia is a fairly solid defender and a good three-point shooter, so I don't hate that as a replacement, but at the same time, I don't think he's going to provide nearly the value that Dorian Finney-Smith did, especially given Dorian Finney-Smith's versatile defense. I think Finney-Smith is just really one of the better defenders in the league, and LaRavia, while he's solid on that end of the floor, I don't think he'll be able to provide as much value. The other big move that they had was signing DeAndre Ayton to fill that center void, which they desperately needed to do. I don't personally love Ayton as a player. There's been effort concerns. He really isn't the lob threat that he should be, given his physical gifts. Not as good of a defender as he should be. Sort of likewise, given his really elite physical tools and athleticism, he should be a lot better in that end of the floor. I do think playing with the Lakers, and especially playing alongside Luka, will help him in that regard. So I do think we could see sort of the best version of Ayton, sort of similar to what we saw when he was playing next to Chris Paul and Devin Booker with the Suns. Regardless, even though I'm not the biggest fan, I think this was a move they had to make, and given the other options on the market, I think this is sort of the best they could have done at center, so can't fault them too much, but still a little bit dubious of the fit, I guess. Other than that, they brought in Marcus Smart, which I thought was a solid sign, and you definitely need another defender there. So I thought that's a solid pickup. We'll see how much he can play. Injuries has been a big problem for him, but on paper, I think that's a really solid pickup. Just getting a guy who can defend multiple positions and is a really high-level defender when he's healthy is a nice move. The vibes aspect of the Lakers offseason, I would say, has been pretty bad, just with all the LeBron rumors, and I think both sides are just sort of not doing their best, so to speak. I think they're sort of, LeBron's making his passive-aggressive comments, the Lakers are sort of making their passive-aggressive comments, and there does seem to be some tension, and just having that noise going into the season, I don't love, and I think both sides could have just sort of handled it better. LeBron, starting with him, I think, the Lakers, they just drafted his son. And yeah, at this point of his career, he's 40 years old, and when you trade for Luka, it sort of does change into Luka's team. But at the same time, from the Lakers side of things, you have to respect LeBron. You have to tell him beforehand about the ownership sale, especially if you're telling Luka. So you do have to really respect just how great of a player he is, one of the greatest players of all time, obviously, and then just what he's meant to your franchise over the last 8 years. So I think both sides could have handled it better, and I just don't love that tension aspect going into the regular season. So that, along with how they handled the Finney-Smith situation, does bump their grade down a little bit, but I do like some of their pickups in the offseason. All right, now moving ahead to the Denver Nuggets. I'm going to give them an A+. They're another one of my clear winners, along with the Rockets and Hawks of this offseason. When you look at this team, the supporting cast around Nikola Jokic has always been a massive problem, especially last year. And they addressed that in the best way possible. Talked about it from the net side of things earlier. The Cam Johnson, Michael Porter Jr. swap. Don't love it for the Nets. With that being said, awesome move for the Nuggets. Not only is Cam Johnson a better version of Michael Porter Jr., and I think he's going to thrive next to Jokic, but you freed up some significant cap space, which allowed you to make some big moves. So that's an absolute win, and you're really maximizing this roster around Jokic and really setting yourself up to win a title within the next couple of years, in my opinion. So that's just huge. And then you go out and you get some more floor space in Tim Hardaway Jr. 3-point shooting was a massive problem for the Nuggets last year. So that's a big pickup. You bring back Bruce Brown, who was a key part of that 2023 title run. I think he's going to really rejuvenate his career after sort of having a weird couple years away from the Nuggets. Played for 3 different teams, was really injured for most of the time. But with the Nuggets and with this system, especially playing next to Jokic, I think we're going to once again see the best version of Bruce Brown, who's super versatile, really good defender, and a really nice secondary creator and playmaker as well. So I think we're going to see Bruce Brown have a real impact for this team. And then the final move they made was trading Dario Saric for Jonas Valanciunas. And this is really an awesome move. When you look at the Nuggets, they've always struggled to maintain any sort of quality offense with Jokic off the court. And while Valanciunas isn't an elite center by any means, he's certainly one of the better backups in the league, and he will help them play to a very solid level with Jokic off the court. And I think that's incredibly massive for this Nuggets team that, like I've said, for the last 5 or 6 years has really struggled with Jokic off the court. He's by far the best backup Jokic has ever had. So when you look at this team, they filled in their main needs of 3-point shooting and depth, and I think they're well positioned to be clear contenders in the West. You look at them last year with a significantly worse roster and then firing their coach shortly before the playoffs. They were still able to take champion Denver Nuggets, or the eventual champion Oklahoma City Thunder, to 7 games and really gave them their toughest battle, maybe excluding the Pacers in the finals, but really gave the eventual champs a run for their money. And I think they can do the same and maybe even come out of the West this year, potentially win it all. We'll see. I'm very high on this Nuggets team heading into this season. Moving along to the Los Angeles Clippers, I'm going to give them an A-. I really like their offseason. You'll see a lot of jokes about sort of the age of the roster. I think that's fine. But when you look at how they upgraded their needs and the overall talent of this team, it's kind of undeniable. I wouldn't have them in that Denver, Oklahoma City, Houston tier of contenders in the West, but they're right below them, and they certainly have a puncher's chance heading into next season. Last year, I think the biggest needs for them were sort of big man depth and then extra creation and playmaking, and they really addressed both of those nicely. You look at getting John Collins in that Norman Powell trade. I thought that was a really nice pickup. I think he can provide some serious value to this team. And then Brook Lopez in free agency was a really nice pickup. They didn't pay too much for him. Obviously, he's getting a little bit older, but still a really high-quality player. So I like both of those moves. And then they went out and signed Bradley Beal and Chris Paul. I think both of those guys will make strong impacts on the team. Starting with Beal, I think there's a lot of backlash given his contract and certainly the no-trade clause there. But when you look at him on a $5 to $6 million deal, it's excellent value compared to a $50 million deal that he was on previously. So I think he can be really impactful for this team. Still a really high-level, 3-level scorer. And then he can provide some extra playmaking next to Harden. So I think he's really a perfect fit. And he's sort of an upgrade in that Norman Powell spot. So they were able to get a little bit better there along with upgrading their center depth. And then Chris Paul, I think he provides some really nice stability. And then Chris Paul, I think he provides some really nice stability for this team. He played all 82 games last year, which is just insane given his age. But just having another guy who can run the offense when Harden's on the bench will be huge for this team. I think we'll even see Paul next to Harden at times. And just the playmaking there is massive, especially given the upgrades they had in their front court. And I think Paul will be a perfect fit with some of those guys, especially John Collins throwing him lobs. And then you look at Zubac, the season he's coming off of. I think that's another guy that Paul will really mesh with nicely. So I think it's a nice fit for this team, and it's really cool to see Chris Paul return into LA, where really some of the best years of his career took place. So yeah, it's cool. I think, like I said, they're probably a little bit below some of those top teams in the West, but they upgraded their roster in a significant way. Yeah, you can always make fun of the age thing, but at the same time, this is a very talented team. They do have a ton of experience, and if everything falls into place, I could see them making a serious playoff run. So yeah, I'm gonna give them a A-, and I really liked what I saw from this Clippers team. Moving on to the Minnesota Timberwolves, which is the team that I cover. I really like this offseason for the Wolves. I'm gonna go with a B+. They unfortunately lost Nickeil Alexander-Walker to the Hawks, but it was clear that they were never going to be able to afford Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Naz Reid, and Julius Randle. So just being able to re-sign Reid and Randle is massive for this team, and I thought the contracts, especially Randle's contract, were really solid values. So I think that's a massive win for this team. And they're really going to lean into their continuity, which last year they did get off to a bit of a slow start, sort of integrating Randle and DiVincenzo into the offense as they traded for them shortly before the season started. So that was a little bit challenging for them, but once they really got those reps together, this was an incredible team. They finished the season with a 16-4 record in the last 20 games and then made a run to the conference finals. So I think that's a massive advantage for them. I do consider them a clear threat in the West. Maybe more in that Clippers tier. I would probably have them as the fourth best team in the West behind Denver, Houston, Oklahoma City. But you got to give them a chance given what they've shown in the playoffs the last few years. And the two-way balance and the star power of this team, I think, really positions them nicely. They also drafted Johan Berenger, which I think was a really solid pick. A guy that can ultimately be Gobert's successor when he ultimately gets too old. Berenger showed a lot in Summer League, especially in the defensive end of the court. He's super versatile and provides really elite rim protection. We'll see how the offense comes along. I'm not expecting him to play a massive role as a rookie, but as a developmental piece, and getting him at pick 17 I thought was a really solid pick, and I'm definitely intrigued to see how he'll develop and what kind of role he'll play this year. And then going back to the Nickeil Alexander-Walker piece of this offseason, it is unfortunate to lose him, but at the same time, you do have Terrence Shannon Jr. and Jalen Clark, who can really fill in that void. Terrence Shannon Jr. was just incredible in Summer League, so I think he's going to have a big role, especially as a scorer. But you look at Jalen Clark, he really has that quintessential D skill set, especially if he can continue shooting the ball the way he did last season. The defense is already at a really high level, so I think both of those guys can sort of fill in different aspects of Nas' impact, and I'm excited to see how they take a step up this year. And then you look at Rob Dillingham, more of a traditional point guard, but having that playmaking presence and scoring presence off the bench, I think will be big for them. I'm expecting a much bigger role than he had his rookie season, and I think he's going to play a lot more, especially with Mike Conley aging. So I really like the way this team is positioned, and I have no problem with them sort of doubling down on their continuity and believe it in this core, especially given what we saw from them in the playoffs. I'm going to go with the B+. I like their combination of experience and youth, and yeah, I think this team is just ultimately really positioned nicely. All right, going over to the Golden State Warriors, they're a little bit of a hard team to gauge because they quite literally have done nothing in the offseason up until this point. I'm going to give them a C/incomplete. Because their offseason is far from done. It's been long rumored that they're destined to sign Al Horford, essentially. There's been mutual interest since the start of the offseason. What's holding this all up is the Jonathan Kuminga situation. They're still negotiating on a contract or potential sign-and trade. Sacramento, Chicago, and Phoenix are three teams with serious interest in Kuminga, and potentially are going to look to sign him to a bigger deal than the Warriors are comfortable offering, and then the Warriors might get some assets back. Or potentially they might just re-sign Kuminga and look to trade him down the road, or maybe just play out whatever contract they agree to him on, but this has been really a tumultuous relationship, so I'd sort of be surprised to see him back. I think a sign-and trade is where it's ultimately trending. It's just a matter of figuring out what team and what they're really willing to give up in exchange for Kuminga. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's tough to grade this team because they literally haven't done anything yet. I don't know how to feel about how they're handling this Kuminga situation. I'm a little bit surprised that it's taken this long. But yeah, I do think it's most likely going to end with Kuminga playing for a new team and them just signing Al Horford. Horford, I think, is a really solid pickup for this team. Despite the age, definitely a concern. Probably will be his last season, but he's still playing at a super high level. He's extremely versatile. He can shoot the three ball really nicely. Play makes a little bit as well. Can really guard multiple positions on defense despite his advanced age, which I think is a positive, especially in this Warriors system. And I think he's sort of the prototypical center that could thrive in this system. So I think it's definitely a very nice pickup. When you look at the average age of this core, assuming they add Horford along with Draymond, Steph, and Jimmy, it is extremely old. So over the course of an 82-game season and a 2-month playoff, that does sort of concern me a little bit. And I don't have anything close to like title aspirations for this team, but I would expect them to be super competitive. They can maybe win a playoff series. Who knows? Maybe if things break right, they can make a conference finals run. But I sort of see that as the ceiling for this team in a competitive Western Conference. But I don't think there's any shame in that, especially at this stage of Steph's career. He probably doesn't have a ton of time left, so just maximizing the teams to be at least competitive in sort of his later years, I think, is a positive. But yeah, overall, just a weird offseason. It's tough to talk about it because you're sort of just speculating at this point. So yeah, I'm just going to give him a C/incomplete. It just doesn't feel like it's a finished story at this point. Definitely if they get good value back in a potential sign and trade for Kuminga and then sign Horford, which has been assumed by many people, I could see them moving up into the B range. But yeah, just a really strange offseason so far for a team that I do think needs to address some roster needs, especially at that center position. Next up, we got the Memphis Grizzlies. I'm going to go with an A- here. Didn't expect them to trade Desmond Bane this offseason, but given the value they got in return for him, I can totally see why they did it, and I thought that was a really smart trade for them. I don't know exactly where this team is positioned, if they're sort of trying to take this as like a rebuilding gap year in a super competitive West, or if they're just going to try to make the playoffs again and see what they have with this Jaren Jackson Jr. pairing. But I think they're nicely positioned either way, given how many future assets they have. And some of the young talent, I'm very high on Jalen Wells. He had a super nice rookie season, so I think that's going to be massive for them. The other move that they had was drafting Cedric Howard. They traded up to get him, and I thought that was just an incredible pick. Super similar to Wells. Really just a versatile defender. Super impactful off the ball on defense especially, and then he can create his own shot at a high level, and he can really hit threes at a high level as well. I mean, when you look at a guy who has, I think, 7'2" wingspan, along with some of the offensive skills that he has, I think he's going to be a super high quality NBA player, and I think that fit next to Wells is awesome. And trading up to get him, I thought was a really smart move. I think they traded up 5 spots to get him at 11. So yeah, I really love that pick for them, and I'm confident that they can replicate some of Bane's impact between Coward and Wells. I don't think this is necessarily a playoff team. I think they'll be in the play-in range. Just given how competitive the West is, I do see them as maybe that like 9 seed, right on the edge of the playoffs. But yeah, overall, still a franchise that's in a nice spot. And then the other move they had was Ty Jerome. I thought that was a really solid pickup. Gives you some Ja Morant insurance, which is much needed given his injury history. So I thought that was a really nice pickup. And then he's a guy that can also just run the offense when Ja's simply on the bench when he's healthy. So I think that's a really nice move. And for the value they got there with Jerome, I didn't think they overpaid at all. It was a lot cheaper than I expected. Sort of as I talked about earlier with the Cavs, I thought, given what he signed for, I thought the Cavs could have just re-signed him. So for Memphis, I think that's an awesome move, and I do like what they did there. All right, moving on to the Dallas Mavericks. Kind of a weird team to grade because, well, they ended up winning the lottery and drafting Cooper Flag. So you're not going to obviously give them a bad grade in any way, but I don't want to give them too much credit for making the obvious pick and Flag. With that being said, I'm going to go with a B. Other than Flag, their main move was signing D'Angelo Russell. I thought that was a fine signing, given the point guards that are on the market. You definitely needed another guard in that backcourt with Kyrie Irving. Injured, at least to start the year, probably going to be injured for the majority of the year because he tore his ACL in like February or March. So you definitely needed someone. I'm personally not the biggest D'Angelo Russell guy, but fine signing. Given the options they had, I would have maybe liked to see them pursue like a Malcolm Brogdon, but he's also injury prone. So I get going with D'Angelo Russell, who's a little bit younger. I do think this team has the defensive infrastructure to cover up some of Russell's weaknesses. And if he's asked to play more of that playmaking role next to Anthony Davis, who he has experience playing next to, and then Cooper Flag, I think it's going to sort of benefit him, and we could see Russell in a more positive light. I don't view him as a long-term fit with this team, however, and they only signed to 2-year deals. So he's probably not going to be around for a super long time. So I think that move overall does make sense. And then Flag, I do think, especially just with their guard depth. It is somewhat of a weak point, even though they did bring in Russell. They didn't re-sign Dinwiddie. I think that sort of opens the door for Cooper to play some point forward, so I think that's a massive advantage for the Mavs and something that's super intriguing. Personally, I'm not as high on the Mavs as everyone else. I think they could compete for that a playoff seed, but I'm not guaranteeing them as a playoff team by any means. I am super interested to see what Flag looks like with this team, and I think it's an awesome situation. And I will say this team's defense is going to be absolutely lethal. You look at Cooper Flag, who's an incredible defensive prospect, and then you pair him with Anthony Davis, Daniel Gafford, Derek Lively, even PJ Washington. I think this is going to be a very formidable defense. I just have some questions about the offense. But yeah, ultimately, I mean, it's a very weird spot after trading Luka back in February, but you're able to get Flag, and you have that potential franchise guy there. So it should be super intriguing to see how the season plays out for this Mavericks team. But yeah, like I said, I'm going to just give them a B+. Very intriguing team. We'll see how the season plays out. But yeah, very solid offseason, no doubt, in large part due to the luck of winning the lottery. But I guess as Nico Harrison says, fortune favors the bold. All right, we're going to move on to the Sacramento Kings, where I'm going to jot in at a B. A lot of people would probably have the Kings a little lower. I didn't hate their offseason by any means. I think Dennis Schroeder was a really solid pickup. Yeah, in a vacuum. Might be a little bit of an overpay. But they desperately needed a point guard. So I think Brennan and Schroeder's a positive. I absolutely loved what they did in the draft. They traded up to get Nick Clifford, who projects to be an awesome fit. They needed sort of another versatile, do-it-all win. So I think that's a really solid move. And I think getting him at pick 25, they traded up to, is just incredible value. So I love that one. And then Maxime Reynaud in the second round, I think, is another really high-quality pick. He can back up Sabonis. We'll see how much he plays because he is a second-round pick. But sort of as that floor spacing, drop coverage big, is a super intriguing pick in the second round. And he was considered a first-round talent by many people. So I thought the Kings actually had one of the more underrated drafts. That paired with their signing of Schroeder, I thought, bodes well for them and gives them a really solid offseason. Now, there is a lot of rumors about their interest in Kuminga and sort of other players, including Russell Westbrook, who it has been rumored that to sign Russell Westbrook, they're going to potentially look to trade Malik Monk or Devin Carter. Now, that would certainly bump the Kings down for me, but for now, I think a B is a fair grade. If they do trade Monk or Carter, though, I have to look at this offseason differently. I don't know why you'd trade either of those players. I mean, especially Carter. I guess Monk, it kind of makes a little bit more sense because he is a little bit redundant with Zach LaVine, and he can give you some really solid trade value as well as some cap relief to sign Westbrook. But if you're trading Devin Carter, who you just drafted in the lottery last year and was injured for most of his rookie season, I don't really see the logic in that. Given what he produced as a rookie, he's probably not going to have crazy trade value, and you're not going to get much cap relief there. I would just rather keep Carter, especially you do have significant open minutes at that point guard spot without signing Westbrook. I would see what you got with Carter. I'm super high on him. He's sort of a do-it-all point guard. He can defend at a high level, play make, rebound. We'll see how the shot translates. Looks really good in Summer League. He's a little bit older despite being a second-year player, so maybe that's why. But I'd just like to see what you have with Carter, and I think giving up on him this soon would be absolutely foolish. And then Monk is another guy I would still look to keep, but I can see the logic a little bit more of trading him. But we'll see. I mean, if they do either of those, I'd probably bump it down to C range. But for now, I think B is a fair grade, and I think this Kings offseason is getting a little bit of unfair criticism. I mean, I get you probably don't want to have a core of DeRozan, LaVine, and Sabonis going forward, but I don't know if this offseason was the right time to make one of those big moves. I mean, you just traded for LaVine in February. DeRozan's trade value isn't probably super high. And then Sabonis, I don't even know what his market would look like either. So I can definitely see why the Kings are sort of just going to ride it out with this team. I don't think this is a playoff team by any means, but see what you have. I don't think they really had another better option, and I like some of the moves they made. So that's why I'm a little bit higher on this Sacramento offseason than some people are. Next, moving on to the Portland Trailblazers, who had one of the more interesting offseasons. I'm going to go with a B. They brought back Damian Lillard, which was probably the highlight of their offseason, and I think that's super cool. Obviously, he's not going to play. He's not going to play next year because of the Achilles injury, but I think he'll just be a really solid veteran presence for this team. And it's cool to see them reuniting. And then long term, I think he'll be. It'll be nice to see him finish his career there, and I think he can play a solid role next to Scoot Henderson and Drew Holiday, who they traded for. So I thought that was just a really cool story. Long-term basketball-wise, I don't know how much it will benefit them, but I do think it moves them closer to sort of being in the mix for the playoffs at least. And then the Drew Holiday trade, from their perspective, another move that definitely makes them more competitive, especially this upcoming season. Sort of obviously different from Lillard because he's going to play next year, but I like that fit for them, sort of as a culture guy, really defensive-minded point guard. And I think that's going to really benefit them, especially given their identity of defense. They had one of the better defenses in the league last year after the All-Star break, so leaning into that makes sense. I don't mind giving up Simons in that deal for them. I don't think he was a long-term part of their team. I did think they might have been able to get a little bit more, but at the same time, he's going to be a free agent next summer, so I think that does hurt his value a little bit. So I don't mind sort of leaning into being a little bit more competitive for this Blazers team. I don't know where they stack up in the West, but I could maybe see them making the play-in. I think that would probably be their ceiling, but definitely not one of the worst teams in the West at the same time. And then their other big move was trading down to draft Jan Hansen, who's a super intriguing big man prospect. Definitely the shocker of draft night when they picked him at 16. So they made that trade with the Grizzlies, who traded up to get Coward, like we discussed before. Yeah, I mean, I'm very intrigued to see what Jan can do in the NBA, sort of in that mold of like a Sabonis or a Şengün, of a passing big man who can rebound really well. We'll see sort of how the defense translates and how he translates as a scorer, but he is very large. I think he's 7'2", so he does have that sort of like post-game and that ability to be a high-level scorer. Definitely a shocker, though. Definitely not a guy that I watched a ton of film on either, heading into the pre-draft process, but a super intriguing player, and I do like the fit between him and Donovan Clinton on paper, so I think that's going to be super intriguing to watch with this Blazers team. And then they also waived DeAndre Ayton, who I was very surprised that they waived him, honestly, even though I'm not super high on him. I thought he still had some level of trade value, but I guess not. But yeah, no problem for me getting rid of Ayton. I just don't think he fit this team's identity very well, so I don't really mind that, although I was a bit surprised they couldn't get anything for him. So yeah, overall, interesting offseason, and it's clear that this Blazers team is sort of over completely rebuilding and trying to be one of the worst teams, and I think we even saw that last year with how they finished the season. So I think they're going to compete for a play-in spot and be a super fun team to watch, even if they're not incredibly good. So I'm very intrigued by this Blazers team, and I definitely like some of their moves. I'm going to go with a B. All right, moving on to the Phoenix Suns. I'm going to give them a C. The Durant trade had to be done. I guess that was the best value you got. From a pick standpoint, I think getting the 10th overall pick and then 5 second-round picks is pretty solid. I definitely like the Malawach pick at 10. I was surprised he fell to them. But especially given their need for a center, I thought that was a home run pick. And I'm pretty high in Malawach, so I think that was a really nice move. I don't love the Devin Booker and Jalen Green fit at all. I think that's one real negative with this trade and this pairing overall. I'm a little bit surprised they couldn't have gone a little bit better of a deal. I know like the Raptors were considered in the mix, but Durant didn't want to go there. Sort of same thing with the Timberwolves, but I think both of those teams, if Durant was willing to go there and if the offers that were reported were true, would have been a lot better for the Suns' perspective. A little bit surprised, even like the Spurs didn't have a better offer, but yeah, I mean, Jalen Green, incredible talent, really good scorer, but just super inconsistent, doesn't offer a ton defensively or as a playmaker. And that type of player next to Booker, it hasn't proven to be a good fit. So I'm a little bit low on that pairing. And then you end up waiving Bradley Beal and getting out of that mess, which is totally fine. Also gets you under the second apron, which is massive for them. But at the same time, from a talent standpoint, I don't think this team got better at all. And from a fit standpoint, like I said, I'm really concerned about Booker and Green together. I don't think that works. They're in the mix for Kuminga, so we'll see if that ends up materializing. I would be intrigued, but not excited, I guess. I wouldn't be super high on that fit either. The other big move they had was trading for Mark Williams. A big part of that was trading the 29th pick of the draft, which became Liam McNeely to Charlotte, to get Mark Williams, but being able to really upgrade that center rotation, which was just absolutely abysmal last year, I think is a win for them and definitely boost their grade a little bit. But at the same time,
where this team's positioned, having quite literally no future first round picks, and a pairing that doesn't really make sense in the backcourt. I don't love the fact that they decided not to get a point guard. I would have explored getting a guy like Brogdon in there, which is still possible, I guess, because he's a free agent, but it doesn't look like that's going to be the move. Or even like Westbrook. I don't think the whole point Booker experiment has worked. We've seen it several times throughout his career. Maybe this will be the time that it works, but I don't see it as being the best option for them. I think Booker thrives next to more of a traditional point guard. Obviously, we saw it didn't work to the highest level with Tyus Jones last year, but I think it's worth trying pairing him with a point guard. I think it just makes sense. I don't think anybody would argue that he's naturally a point guard by any means. I think he's pretty clearly a shooting guard, maybe even like small forward type. So yeah, I really, that's probably my biggest critique with this Suns offseason is just not getting that natural point guard next to him. I signed Jared Butler, who's an intriguing player, someone I'm pretty high on. He had some nice moments with the Sixers, but as a starting point guard option next to Booker, I don't really think so. I expect him to come off the bench. I think they could have done a little bit better in that regard because you're pretty much left with Butler and Colin Gillespie as the only real point guards on this roster. Two solid, intriguing young players, but probably two guys that won't maximize Booker's skill set or are the most talented point guards to have next to Booker. So I don't love that. One thing before I forget about it, I also did love the Rasheer Fleming pick. They got him at the beginning of the second round. I thought that was an awesome pick, and he's a guy that's super versatile defensively. He can make a really strong impact, so that does boost up their grade a little as well. But still, overall, I think this roster is just so flawed, and I think they could have done a better job of addressing some of those flaws, especially in a Durant trade. So yeah, I'm gonna go with a C for this Suns team. I don't expect them to be much different from last season. Maybe they could be a playoff team. Maybe they can definitely be one of those play-in seeds. But for me right now, when I'm looking at the standings, I have them more toward that bottom group of Western Conference teams, unfortunately. If they were in the East, different story. But unfortunately, they're in the West. And I just like the vast majority of rosters in the West more than them. And that's really difficult to say for a team that has no future draft capital. Moving on to the San Antonio Spurs, and I really liked what the Spurs did this offseason. What a surprise, one of the better front offices had a really solid offseason. I'm going to give them an A. You look at what they did at the number 2 pick, Dylan Harper. There's some trade rumors there, given the guards that they already have in place with Stephon Castle and De'Aaron Fox, but at the same time, you might as well take the talent, and I've sort of talked myself into Harper being able to fit with these guys, especially given the size of Harper and Castle, and then sort of Castle's off-ball abilities. I think he can be more of that like win type. He doesn't necessarily have to be a traditional point guard. Harper and Fox together, it is going to be a little interesting, but I think it's good for Harper not to necessarily be thrust into the role of like playing 30 minutes a night as a starting point guard, even though he is a really solid prospect. It's always tough for young guards to make that jump to the NBA level. So I think playing behind Fox will help him, and then playing with Castle as well will help him in that regard. I am a little bit concerned about the shooting next to Wemby, but Wemby himself is a really solid floor spacer, so I think that will help this team. And then Devin Vassell as well is another guy who can just really shoot the ball at a high level, so I think that negates some of the concerns, although, yeah, on paper, having those 3 guards together, none of them are great shooters. I can understand the concern, but the talent's there. You kind of had to pick Harper, in my opinion, unless you had an amazing trade offer. So, yeah, that's a win, and just having all that playmaking around Wemby is going to maximize his game. So I think that's huge. And then you look at what they did at pick 14, drafting Carter Bryant, who fits into that identity of really elite and versatile defense. I think that's an absolute home run pick at 14. Was a little bit surprised he fell to them, but when I saw he was still on the board at 14, I was like, yeah, this is such a Spurs pick, and it's easy to see how he'll fit. He's another guy who can also space the floor at a high level, so I think that will help him fit next to Wemby. That definitely boosts their grade a significant amount. And then in free agency, they went ahead and got Luke Kornet, who I think is a perfect backup to Wemby. I think a backup center was something they desperately needed, and Kornet was their best option on the market. So I think that was a fantastic pickup. Some people might look at the contract and say, oh, $4 million, 4 years for Kornet, that's a bit of an overpay. I don't think so. I think that's a really solid value for what Cornet provides, what he's proven to be as a rim protector, as a screener, lob threat. I think that's going to be huge. You can play him next to Wemby. You can play him as a backup to Wemby as well. Survive without Wemby on the court. Maximize Wemby's abilities on the court and double down on that size identity. I think they have a lot of options with Cornet there. And yeah, an awesome pickup. So yeah, I'm going to go A for the Spurs. I'm very high on this team next year. I do see them as a playoff team. I think they're ready to make that jump, especially with Wemby developing another year and then him and De'Aaron Fox getting some more time on the court together, I think will be massive. All right, New Orleans Pelicans. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to go a little negative here. I'm going to go with a D-. It's going to be my lowest grade. I guess let's start with, before we get into all the draft stuff, let's start with the Jordan Poole McCollum trade. I thought that made no sense. I think McCollum is a better player right now. Obviously, he's a little bit older, so maybe they think Poole has more potential, I guess. But McCollum was on a shorter-term deal. Better value contract as well. Not sure why you'd want to bring in Poole to this team. I don't think he really fits a ton. I just think McCollum's a little bit more consistent, better playmaker, better decision maker, better shooter, really just a better all-around player. So that trade didn't make a ton of sense to me. To start off, I believe they did that 1 or 2 days before the draft. And then we get into their actual draft. I talked a little bit about this when I was discussing the Hawks and raving about their offseason. The Pelicans did one of the stupidest possible things. I think everyone's really hammered this point home, but it has to be said. They traded up 10 spots, and they gave up an unprotected pick swap between them and the Bucks. So whatever pick's better, Atlanta gets. Whatever pick between them and the Bucks is worse, Milwaukee gets. So the Pelicans do not have a first-round pick next year. I don't know what they're doing, man. I was at a loss for words when I heard the value of that deal. Other than the Utah Jazz, who we're going to talk about in a second, I don't see a team that the Pelicans are clearly better than in the West. I could definitely see them being a 14 seed again. They just gave up their unprotected first-round pick in a loaded draft class? What are they doing? That one just makes absolutely no sense to me. And then you look at the two guys that they ended up firing David Griffin after the season, and you look at the two guys they brought into their front office. Joe Dumars, who had a successful tenure with the Pistons in the early 2000s, but then his last few years with the Pistons, it sort of went really downhill, and he made some questionable decisions. And then you also bring in Troy Weaver, who's also from the Pistons, who was part of the Pistons team that won 14 games. And he picked Cade Cunningham. That was awesome. But surrounding Cade Cunningham with competent talent and players that made sense with him, especially floor spacing-wise, was something he was unable to do. He did not have a good track record as an executive, and he's proven it again in New Orleans. So I thought bringing in those two guys was questionable, and it turned out to be even more questionable with how their moves played out. And going back to the pick then where they traded up 10 picks and gave up an unprotected pick, reports came out that was all their idea. They called up Atlanta and they said, this is what we want to do. It wasn't like Atlanta negotiated with them to get this first-round pick. This was something they were all in on doing, which makes absolutely no sense. I thought it was just inexplicable. We'll talk about some of the guys they drafted because I actually kind of like them, and that's why they're not getting an F. Traded up to get Derek Queen at 13. I think that's a really solid pickup. Queen was one of my favorite prospects. I think he can fit nicely next to Zion and Yves Missy. Queen's just a super intriguing offensive player. Can handle the ball, create shots for himself, play make at a really high level. He has complete offensive skill set. So I'm very high on Queen. I don't want to get that confused. But giving up an unprotected pick to get him, just unacceptable. Mismanagement of assets. You should have just drafted him at 7 if you liked him that much. And then drafted a guard at 23, quite frankly. I think that would have just been a much better option. Or you trade up to like 17 and you don't give up that first-round pick. Or even trade up to 13 and you don't give up that first-round pick. Because the deal could have been done without the first-round pick, is the point. So yeah, I really didn't like that. Jeremiah Fears, I thought was a really solid pick at 7. Super high upside. Really high-level scorer. I think he's going to be a very good guard. I just think it's going to take a while. So that paired with, again, I hate to harp on it, but it's such a bad mistake, giving up that unprotected first round pick. Doesn't make a lot of sense because when you look at this Pelicans team and some of the players they have, unless Zion is healthy for a full season, which is a big if and something really nobody should be banking on at this stage of his career, this team is really positioned more so for a rebuild with these 2 first round picks. And then the rest of the roster, it strikes me as more of a rebuilding team than a team that's anywhere close competing for the play-in. I do realize they probably wouldn't have been as bad as they were last year if it weren't for significant injuries, but at the same time, with Zion's track record, I can't count on that problem not happening again. And then with the fact that they got younger, I don't think that necessarily bodes well for them as a competitive basketball team next year. So yeah, I do see this, unfortunately, as one of the worst teams in the West, and just absolutely baffled by their decision-making. I guess their only other move was bringing in Kevon Looney, another center. I thought that was fine. He's a good rebounder, good hustle guy, nothing crazy. Him with Derek Queen and Yves Messi, that's not the reason they're getting a D-. It's because they gave up their unprotected pick when they're probably going to be one of the worst 5 teams in the league. But yeah, really rough offseason for the Pelicans. If you have Pelicans fans in your life, just please check in on them. All right, Utah Jazz, closing it out. I'm going to give the Jazz a C-. Kind of similar, though, with the Nets. I thought they had a little bit of opportunity to have a better offseason, quite frankly. I did like what they did in the draft. I really did. I thought East Bailey at 5. It's kind of a risk worth taking for them. Personally, not the biggest Bailey guy, but you kind of need a star. This is a situation where he can develop, and he can also play next to really high-level playmakers, which I think he needs to maximize his skill set. I do like Isaiah Collier, and I think that fits going to be nicely. And then you look at trading up to get Walter Clayton Jr. after taking a big swing on Bailey. Clayton's more of a safer prospect. He's going to be a really high-level scorer in the NBA, so I think that was a really nice move, and I think those 2 pieces are really solid for their rebuild. Other than that, they did sort of got their roster of any chance of being competitive. I think their pick is like top 8 or top 10 protected next year, something like that. So that's where they're really trying to secure their pick and take another season as one of the worst teams in the league, and then try to get one of those top picks. Didn't quite work out this year because they fell to 5, but they ended up getting Bailey, so I guess it did. But yeah, they're really eyeing a top 3 pick in this loaded 2026 draft class, and I think they will get that. If I had to guess, unless they have some terrible lottery luck. Them and the Nets definitely have the worst rosters in the league. So they're positioned nicely in that regard. I just don't love the value they got for some of their guys. Not that any of these guys were going to have crazy trade value, but John Collins, I think they ended up having to ship out a second-round pick along with him. Then you pretty much just get Kyle Anderson and Kevin Love back. Love could be bought out. He could retire. Who knows? And then Anderson also could be bought out. So you pretty much gave up John Collins for nothing. The real kicker for me was trading for Yusuf Nurkic for Sexton. I'm shocked his value was that low. Nurkic I view as a negative asset. Guess he's not viewed as a negative asset around the league, but I don't know why after the season he's coming off of. But yeah, I thought that was a really strange trade. I thought they could have gotten a ton more for Sexton. I thought Sexton was a guy who could have gone for a first-round pick, honestly. Just considering his abilities as a scorer, he's a solid playmaker, gritty defender. I think he could have offered a lot of value to contending teams. I did like the pickup for the Hornets, as I discussed earlier, but I thought a contending team was going to sort of give a bit of a higher price to land him. Ultimately, that didn't happen, which I think is a little unfortunate for Utah, but yeah, here we are. Their other move was waving Jordan Clarkson, which, again, I didn't think his trade value was anything crazy, but maybe you could have gotten like a second-round pick for him or something. I guess not, though. You got absolutely no value for him. So yeah, I don't mind this direction. But yeah, overall, entering your 4th year of a rebuild with not much to show for it isn't an ideal position for this Jazz team. And hopefully they can get a top pick in this upcoming draft. Otherwise, this offseason will look really bad for them. But yeah, I was definitely shocked at some of the lack of value they got for their win-now assets. We'll see if they end up trading Lauri Markkanen. I wouldn't be surprised if he gets traded by the deadline. Probably not this offseason at the point we're at right now, but that's another guy I would keep my eye on as a potential trade candidate for the Jazz. Yeah, overall, I love their draft, so that really boosts their grade. Draft, that would be A range. I thought they had an awesome draft. other moves I didn't love, so that really drags their grade down and ultimately brings it to a C. All right, we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Cassels Cast. I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts on every team's offseason, and I'll catch you guys on the next episode.